A quick thank you to everyone who's watched this channel in 2021. We only launched in January, but we've already picked up 230,000 subscribers, making us the third biggest TLDR channel. So if you're not subscribed already, hit the button to get more from us in 2022 and beyond. Anyway, in this one, we're going to be taking a look at Hong Kong, a city that's increasingly under Chinese control. In fact, since the last major election in 2016, China has fundamentally changed the country's democratic system, making it, well, less democratic. So let's take a look at the results of the vote and what it tells us about how China's rigged and maybe destroyed Hong Kong's democracy. So, before we get into the results, some context. The Legislative Council, otherwise known as LegCo, is the legislative branch of the Hong Kong government. Elections are usually held every 4 years, but not all members are elected in the same way. In the last elections in 2016, half of the 70 seats were elected by multi-member geographical constituencies, which use the largest remainder method. We're not going to explain precisely how this works, but it's a broadly proportional electoral system. For example, in that 2016 election, pro-Beijing parties won about 40% of the vote, and ended up with 16 seats. Pro-democracy parties won about 36% of the vote, and ended up with 13 seats. And localists won about 19% of the vote, and ended up with the remaining 6 seats. The other half were elected by so-called functional constituencies. In 30 of the 35 functional constituencies, the electorate isn't restricted by geography, but rather by sector. For example, the agriculture and fisheries industry has a seat in LegCo, elected only by specific people in the agriculture and fisheries industry. These functional constituencies are usually pretty restrictive though. It's not like every fisherman in Hong Kong gets a vote, only the big players in the industry. So, in total, only about 140,000 Hong Kongers are members of functional constituencies. Typically, this means that functional constituencies lean pro-Beijing, because business elites are much more likely to be cosy with the CCP. In the 2016 election, for example, 22 of the seats went to pro-Beijing parties, while just 7 went to pro-democracy parties, and 1 went to an independent party. The remaining 5 functional constituencies, known as super seats, are a touch more democratic. Introduced in 2010, anyone who's not a member of a functional constituency sector, i.e. most of Hong Kong, can vote in super seat elections. In 2016, 2 super seats were won by the Democratic Alliance for the Betterment and Progress of Hong Kong, a pro-Beijing centre-right party, while the remaining 3 seats were won by the Pro-Democracy Party and the Neighbourhood and Workers' Service Centre. So, this is what the overall LegCo looked like after the 2016 election. Anyway, under this electoral system, pro-democracy parties hope to win a 35+ majority at the next election, which were originally scheduled to be held in September 2020. A pro-democracy majority in LegCo would make it a lot harder for the chief executive to pass through any pro-Beijing legislation, and put China under massive political pressure. Now, this was always going to be difficult to make a reality. After all, functional constituencies tend to elect pro-Beijing LegCo members, and that would have meant that pro-democracy groups would have needed substantially more than a majority of the geographical constituency members, and probably substantially more than half the vote. Nonetheless, they were feeling pretty optimistic because of their recent success in the 2019 district council elections, where pro-democracy parties performed astonishingly well, winning 388 of the 452 available seats, up from 124 in 2015. Anyway, somewhat unsurprisingly, the CCP decided that they weren't having any of this. And in June of 2020, 12 pro-democracy candidates, including 4 incumbents, were disqualified from running. And Chief Executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, used emergency powers to push the election back a year until September 5th, 2021. According to Lam, this was because of the pandemic, but it was quite convenient timing for Beijing, because it meant it gave them more time to essentially rig the upcoming elections. So, as expected, in July of this year, Beijing imposed a national security law on Hong Kong in response to growing protests, which gave the CCP sweeping powers to essentially detain or arrest anyone considered too pro-democracy. And that's exactly what they did. More than 100 people have so far been arrested under this law, and the crackdown successfully squashed the protests. Then, in March 2021, Beijing passed another law reforming Hong Kong's electoral system and making two main changes. Firstly, any LegCo candidate has to be vetted by Beijing, and any candidate deemed insufficiently patriotic to China would be banned from running. Somewhat unsurprisingly, it turns out the CCP's bar for sufficiently patriotic is pretty high. According to the South China Post, only 3 of the 153 candidates contesting this election openly identify as pro-democracy. Secondly, they expanded the number of LegCo seats from 70 to 90, and reduced the number of geographical constituencies from 35 to 20. They scrapped the super seats and made the remaining 40 seats elected by the 1,500-member election committee. The makeup of the election committee is somewhat complicated, but all you really need to know is that it's overwhelmingly pro-Beijing. Most of its members are business elites elected by functional sectors, and the 117 members that were previously chosen by the elected district councillors, and so might have been a bit pro-democracy, were scrapped under the new law. Anyway, you get the point. Across the board, the new electoral system essentially froze out the pro-democracy forces. So, with this democracy freezing effect in place, what were the results? Well, looking at which candidates won doesn't really tell us anything, because all of these candidates were handpicked by the CCP anyway. But the turnout is more revealing. In the end, pro-democracy Hong Kongers decided that the only way for them to express their discontent was to boycott the election altogether. Wary of an embarrassingly low turnout, the CCP tried to crack down on this boycott. Hong Kongers were even warned that spoiling your ballot could violate the new national security law, and some people have been arrested for just sharing pro-boycott material on social media. They also tried to encourage voting by making public transport free on election day and sending out text reminders a day before. And presumably to appease Beijing, several big businesses also took steps to encourage their employees to vote. KPMG, for example, promised all voting employees an extra day of holiday. But even with all of this, turnout was still extraordinarily low. Just 30% of Hong Kongers cast votes, about half of the 58% of citizens who voted in 2016, and the lowest since Hong Kong started holding legislative elections in 1991. The previous low of 36% came in the slightly pointless 1996 election, which was held just a year before Hong Kong returned to Chinese control. This remarkably low turnout essentially confirms what we've known since the 2019 elections. A sizable and growing fraction of Hong Kongers are dissatisfied with their new pseudo-democracy. Somewhat entertainingly, Hong Kong's CCP-aligned chief executive, Carrie Lam, claimed that the low turnout was a sign that voters were actually satisfied with the government. Speaking to the Global Times, a Chinese state media outlet, Lam claimed that when the government is doing well and credibility is high, voter turnout will decrease because people do not have strong demand to choose different lawmakers and supervise the government. But anyway, that's the big takeaway. As an expression of dissatisfaction, and in spite of the CCP's best effort, Hong Kongers refused to vote, leading to historically low turnouts in this election. But does this change anything? Well, not really. It shows that Hong Kongers are still not keen on the CCP, but if the only thing they can do is spoil their ballots, the CCP won't be too worried, given that even massive protests didn't stop them from cracking down last year. Anyway, what do you think? Will this low turnout impact the CCP's plans at all, or will they just choose to ignore it and hope they can just push it under the rug like the protests? As always, comment your thoughts down below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release new videos like this one. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.